Rutger Bregman, welcome to Wharton.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Is it though?
It is.
Because I think you have some strong opinions in this book, which by the way is not even out yet. So this is, I think, I don't know if I'm even supposed to have this according to your publisher.
It's not really legal, no. So don't. Are we recording this? We are, right? No, but it's good to be in the belly of the beast, right?
The beast? Is that what you're calling Wharton now?
Sort of. Yeah.
Okay, so we actually have a lot to talk about on that front. Let me start by just saying, when you sent me an early PDF of this book, I was completely fascinated by the idea that morality and ambition could go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Because normally we think about them as either independent, maybe orthogonal, or even opposites.
Yeah.
Like, ambitious people lack morals in American society, frequently, and moral people sometimes are seen as lacking ambition. What gave you the idea that these two things could actually coexist?
So,
what are you thinking, Rutger? That's what I really want to know.
So, for me, this actually started with a different book that I was working on.
This is Humankind?
No, actually, the book that I started writing after that. I was just fascinated by the great moral pioneers of the past. I wanted to write this big book about the abolitionists, the suffragettes, the civil rights campaigners, maybe the animal rights activists. Maybe you know that book by Peter Singer, The Expanding Circle, in which he makes a philosophical argument that over the centuries our moral circle has expanded, and that has been one of the main drivers of moral progress. And I wanted to write the historical version of that, basically tell the stories of the people who did that. And then I started working on the first part about abolitionism, and I learned so many lessons about who these people were and what they had in common. And I indeed discovered that they had something that I started to call moral ambition, which is this rare combination of the idealism of an activist and the ambition of an entrepreneur. And when that comes together, the magic happens.
I love the concept. I think it's a brilliant way to get people who both have clear principles and also a lot of drive to think about how to put those two things together.
Yeah.
Easier said than done in a lot of ways that I think we'll talk about. But I guess, I was thinking when I was reading Moral Ambition, I was thinking about Enron. Some of you are old enough to remember Enron, I imagine. Not everyone in the room, but I remember as one of the great corporate scandals of early 21st century. I remember one of the sort of the foreshadowing comments that Enron was going to go down in flames was Ken Lay, the longtime CEO. He had a comment from his business school professor, if I remember correctly, that said, "Very ambitious, maybe too ambitious." And I thought, if you study those cases, the solution to the excess ambition problem is to dial down ambition. And I think what you're encouraging us to do instead is redirect it.
Exactly.
So talk to us about how. What does it mean to pursue moral ambition?
Well, we all know this famous quote from Margaret Mead, right? Never doubt the power of small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. And people often love that quote, right? They say, oh, that's how we're going to make a difference, right? It's like these starry-eyed idealists saying, we can prevail. But as a historian, I've always found it a pretty dark quote. There's a whole lot of truth in it, but I think about like the communists who took over Russia, or I think about the inner circle of Adolf Hitler, Indeed, it is small groups of really thoughtful, committed people who changed the world. I mean, in this country, in the early 70s, people came together around this agenda for the corporate takeover of the country. There's this infamous Powell memo, for example, written by a corporate lawyer who was on the board of Philip Morris. And it was like, you know what? We're going to build a huge network of think tanks, of business schools, of political action groups, the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, and we're going to take over this country. And that more or less happened. So that's what I think of. But then there are obviously also counterexamples of that, of people who use that same energy, that same ambition to make a massive difference. So it's a pretty brutal statement about how the world works, but it is how it works.
It makes me think that we should stop saying change the world and we should start saying change the world for the better or improve the world.
Yeah.
Like we shouldn't be neutral about in what direction it changed.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe also especially business schools like this. I studied the British abolitionist movement. I spent a lot of time studying that one. And the reason I was so fascinated by it was that most movements against the slave trade and against slavery were utter failures. So I'm from the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, it was a bunch of Calvinists who got nothing done. You know, they were idealistic, but not very ambitious and not very effective. In France, it was a bunch of writers and intellectuals. Well, you can predict how much they got done. In Portugal, there was pretty much nothing. In Spain, there was very little. In the US, obviously, it took a civil war in the end, and abolitionism was extremely unpopular before that. Like, it was worse than being a vegan today. It was only in Britain that it became this huge movement. And the interesting thing is that it started among elites. It was a countercultural revolution among elites who wanted to redefine what it means to be successful. The British Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded by 12 individuals. One was a writer, so there is a place for someone like me. One was a lawyer, they can be useful sometimes, but 10 out of 12, they were entrepreneurs. People who had built their own companies, who had scaled their own companies, who knew how to get shit done. But the reason we remember them today is not because they were rich, and many of them were rich. Now, the reason we remember them is because they used what they had, their capital, their network, their talent, basically their precious resources and their precious time on this earth to make a massive difference. And that really is what moral ambition is. It's not about just saying, oh, you should check your privilege. No, use your privilege. Use what you have to make a big difference.
Got to tell you, Rutger, this sounds like a lot of work.
Absolutely, yeah.
Especially if you're already professionally ambitious.
Yeah.
So how do you think about the problem of, like, I have career goals that I want to achieve. I want to be conventionally successful. I want to be able to support my family. And also now you're saying I need to be ambitious about the amount of good that I do.
Yeah. So in the book, I go on for 10 chapters, basically, you know, hammering people like, come on, you got to do more, you got to do more. And then the epilogue, I'm like, surely, of course, you can take things too far, right? We don't want all of you getting a burnout or like give all your wealth away so that you have to live under a bridge somewhere. Sure, there are limits. But the reason I only say that at the very end of the book is because I think that a lot of people can actually do a lot more. And I think it's like a simple, I mean, you're a psychologist, right? We know that there are diminishing returns to certain status symbols. And for me, like with wealth, it has always seemed so obvious to me, like that this is like a fairly shallow way of pursuing success. I mean, I like flying business class. I just don't like to do it as much because I don't want to get used to it, right? You know, you're just you can never fly economy ever again if you've done that too much. So you don't want the wealth to become a kind of burden to you. I'm happy living my middle-class existence. And at some point I was, also personally, I was like, okay, but like what's the next thing? Like how can I really leave my mark?
So our own Matt Killingsworth has published some research showing that, like, we used to always say, like, yeah, income has diminishing returns for happiness. His data suggests that was wrong. And in fact, like, people who get richer and richer actually tend to get a little happier and happier.
Yeah,
do believe that.
Yeah, but
you're saying we should forego that.
But it's not like purely linear, right?
No, it probably does taper a little.
Yeah, and at some point, it's like from a societal perspective, it's much more rational to give it to other people, right? for whom it will be a much bigger benefit. Look, I understand that. So I'm not like, oh, like you shouldn't care about money, you shouldn't care about material possessions. I mean, I like my new shoes. I bought them for today. Hope you like them as well. But yeah, at some point, it becomes a little bit shallow, I would say. And I guess that's also my message to really ambitious people out there. It's like, look, if this is really what you want out of life, right? You really care about, you know, going on a ski holiday as often as possible, having the biggest possible house, you know, being the richest person in your circle of friends, then sure, you live that life, right? This is a free country. Well, it still is, I think. But like, you have the freedom to be boring. But moral ambition is an invitation to do something much more interesting and much more meaningful with your limited time on this earth. Because this is true for everyone. We're going to die. Right? That, for me, is the most essential fact of life. It's very short. So a life, what is it? Oliver Berkman wrote this beautiful book about 4,000 weeks. Well, a career is 2,000 working weeks. So it's very short. It's like poof, gone. We were just talking backstage about thinking about writing a new book, and now that you're a little bit older, you're like, oh, well, a new book that will, I'll have to, I'm stuck with that for 5 years. So got to think hard about what book I'll actually write. That's also one of the main messages in this book. Like, no matter how wealthy you are, your precious time on this earth, that's your most valuable resource. And how do you want to be remembered?
So I found that to be a really compelling argument. And it reminded me a little bit of some research that Jeremy Freimer led years ago, looking at what do moral exemplars do differently from the rest of us? And not surprisingly, the people that we tend to put on a pedestal as role models tended to be much higher in concern for others than their peers.
Yeah.
But they were also higher in ambition than their peers. And I think that is the fundamental point that you're making here.
Yeah.
I think it gets really complicated when it starts to get practical.
Okay.
So one of the questions I was grappling with here is, isn't the road to hell paved with good intentions?
Sure.
Haven't we seen tremendous amounts of harm, maybe including some examples you referenced earlier, of people who thought they were making the world better and actually made it worse?
Yeah.
So how do you think about knowing whether you're actually, well, if you take the call to do more seriously, how do you know whether you're actually doing better?
So I would say that this book is grounded in a philosophical, ethical tradition that goes back all the way to the abolitionists, who deeply believe that everyone's equal. It actually sort of started with the Quakers, which were this very weird, radical Protestant sect, and they believe that there is a little bit of God in each and every one of us. So therefore, it's utterly immoral to enslave other people, because you're basically enslaving something that's deeply holy. Out of that grew so many beautiful things. So once you start advocating against the slave trade and against slavery, other people were like, well, but then don't women have rights as well? And logically, that movement started developing. It's not a surprise to me that many of the first abolitionists were also deeply passionate about animal rights and about animal suffering. Benjamin Lay, the very first real abolitionist in this country, was a very radical guy. He was a very little man. He lived in a cave in Philadelphia, so not that far away from here, and was even kicked out of 4 Quaker meetings. That's how radical he was. But he was also pretty much the first vegan in this country. And for me, that's not a coincidence. So look, I'm not an ethical philosopher. I'm not like Peter Singer or Will McCaskill. They can give you long philosophical arguments about, why their ideas are the right ones. For me, it's more grounded in history. I see a certain moral progress in the last 2 centuries. And I think it's if you believe in that deep equality of all humans on Earth, like that we all have that the same dignity and the same worth, then yeah, we're not nearly done yet, because we still live in a world where 15,000 kids die every day from easily preventable diseases, and where 85% of the world population lives under the US poverty line. It's such an unjust and unequal world, and there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit of that brilliant, ambitious, driven people can do to make this world not a little bit better. I've always hated that phrase, like, oh, make the world a little bit better. No, make the world wildly better. That's what we can do.
Are you suggesting then that our Penn graduates should not go into banking and consulting?
They should be very, very careful about it. Let's put it like that. So a good friend of mine went to Oxford University, and a couple of years ago, he got an offer from McKinsey. And he always calls it the Bermuda Triangle of talent. So you've got consultancy, corporate law, and finance. It's this dark chasm that sucks up so much talent, and we never hear from these people again. And they become incredibly boring. And once they're past the age of 30, they've got the mortgage, they've got a house, and they're like, and you're at a birthday party or whatever, and like you don't want to. Okay, maybe I'm a bit too blunt now. We Dutch were known to be blunt.
You did say earlier we have the freedom to be boring. So are you trying to take
That's
away
true.
that
That's
freedom?
true. So no, don't want to take away that freedom at all. I'm just warning you.
Can we just get a sense of the audience? How many of you are planning to go into the Bermuda Triangle, as Rutger described? That's about a third of the room.
Yeah. Well, it's worse at Harvard. At Harvard, it's 45% of graduates who go into consultancy and finance.
Oh, I don't think we're doing better here. I just think many of those people did not want to hear you talk today. Like, no one wanted to deal with the cognitive dissonance and the existential anxiety that this conversation was going to promote.
That's true. That's true. Look, there is light at the end of the tunnel. So I co-founded an organization called the School for Moral Ambition. And we like to see ourselves as the Robin Hoods of talent. So we started in Europe last year. We have these fellowship programs, very, very hard to get into. But yeah, we recruit people who have about 10 years of working experience. And some of them have indeed come from McKinsey and have now been liberated by us. Yeah, they're very happy about it.
Do you think, though, I have an easier time making the case for consulting than banking, frankly. I'm not sure where I stand on corporate law, but I think that the learning and development systems that management consulting firms have built are quite valuable early stage in a career, especially if you don't know what you want to do. And we've seen lots of consultants go on to do great things. But even in the banking world, right? I think about great leaders like Jacqueline Novogratz, who took her investment banking expertise and built the Acumen Fund.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it seems like what you're advocating for is not against that necessarily.
No, absolutely. There's a really good argument to be made that especially early in your career, you need that career capital, right? You want to work with the best and brightest. And again, I come from a leftist progressive background, and people like me often have a discomfort in acknowledging that there are vast differences in just how talented and effective people are. I mean, I do think we should broaden our definition of talent. I don't think that this country or like universities like this one, they're not meritocracies, right? You often have to be lucky to get in all kinds of ways. But there are differences, and it's often power law shaped, right? So any venture capitalist will tell you that there's often like this one investment that will generate most of the return of the whole fund. And I think that's often true in the talent space as well. So it does make sense if you're young and really ambitious that you want to go to a place where you feel really challenged, right? You want to work 70, 80 hours a week, you know? You want to work with people who are really ambitious and want to work for the big projects. So I think that is an uncomfortable truth to acknowledge that sometimes, I mean, there are awesome NGOs out there, of course, but there is a reason why many of these top universities only, I think, 1% or 2% go and work for these NGOs because they don't find that challenge, right? They have that deep yearning to do hard work, and they don't always find it in that space.
So I've had the privilege of teaching some of the students who are here with us today, and there's a message I've tried to deliver to them a few times that I want to get your reaction to, and maybe your version of it will land more effectively than mine has. Okay. But the question from those who are morally ambitious, from those who are tempted to go to a nonprofit or an NGO or to build a social enterprise, they are very impatient generally, and they tend to come by office hours and say, like, I want to go and do that immediately. And my reaction to them consistently is, like, what's the rush? I think the single most important investment you can make at the beginning of your career is in your learning and growth. And so that means you should not join the organization that you think is going to do the most good in years 1 or 2. You should join the organization that's going to prepare you to do the most good in years 10 and 20 and 30. And I get so much resistance to that, and really the only success I've had in pushing back against the pushback has been to say something along the following, like, why did you come to Penn? Like, what good are you doing with the 4 years of your education here? Not a lot, right? You've chosen to invest in your learning. Why should that investment end the day you graduate? So help me out here. What is the more effective version of this argument?
So a couple of things to keep in mind. Work isn't just work, right? It changes you as a person. So there was this movement, it still exists, the effective altruism movement. And these people made the argument, more than a decade ago now, that you should actually go into finance because you can earn a shitload of money and then donate that to highly effective charities. And it seems like a really reasonable argument. The pushback here, though, could be that finance is such, problematic environment that it changes you as a person. So you may not be the same person a decade later. And then obviously, well, we all know what came out of that. Sam Bankman-Fried is the most notorious example, who was one of the earlier earning to givers and now in prison.
I would like to think that's a self-selection effect more than a socialization effect, that maybe the kinds of people who are drawn to some of these fields are more inclined to have their values or their decisions correct.
Yeah. That's maybe true. So there's a good argument to be made that this can actually be done, but what you also need is a very powerful community that makes sure that you, that you're still idealistic, right? That you don't change too much as a person, that you don't get used to a certain lifestyle. That's also honestly one of the reasons why we co-founded this organization, the School for Moral Ambition, because we want to build a little bit of, well, in the book I call it a cult, of like-minded, ambitious idealists. And then I think, yes, you could probably take that risk and say, okay, you know what, I'm going to build that career capital at an organization that maybe doesn't do an enormous amount of good right now, but then a couple of years later, I'll be in a great position to go and work on something else. I've got one story in the book about a school in London that is sometimes described as the Hogwarts for do-gooders. It's a little bit like Y Combinator, the organization that is like for the most successful or
Startup accelerator.
Exactly. And they're like the non-profit version of that. So they launch these high-impact NGOs. Also very, very hard to get into. But when I interviewed Joey Savai, the founder of that school, I also asked him this question, like, shouldn't people wait for a bit? And he was like, no time to waste. If you really have that energy, if you're super ambitious, if you're super idealistic, like, do it now. And indeed, I did speak to some of the founders of some of the most amazing NGOs I've ever heard about. And then, did this whole interview. There was one woman in particular, Anna Christina Torsheim, who built this extraordinary NGO, battling maternal mortality in Nigeria. And it was just huge and totally getting out of hand. And at the end of the conversation, I asked her, like, how old are you? And she was, I think, 24 at the time. I just couldn't believe it. It's like, 24? And I'm very glad that she's doing it right now and that she didn't first spend 6 years at McKinsey. Like, because with some people, there's just no time to waste. Like, they've got so much in them. Like, let's go.
I think if you have that clarity of vision, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? I think I'm thinking more of the person who says, look, I want to do good, but I don't exactly know what that looks like yet. So shouldn't I join an organization that's heavily socially conscious? I'm like, maybe, but don't you want to build the knowledge and skills and network that will allow you to do that in a more meaningful way?
Again, there's something to be said for that. The personal fit is really important. But if I can push back again a little bit, at our organization, we believe in the Gandalf-Frodo model of doing good. So Gandalf never really asked Frodo, hey, Frodo, what's your passion, right? He was like, this needs to happen. Throw the ring into the mountain. That's at the top of the world's to-do list. And I think that's also very much what moral ambition is about. If you don't really know what needs to happen, just find yourself a Gandalf, right? You don't need to go out in the world and spend years figuring out who you are, gazing at your navel, right? Just ask some really smart people. Like, there are a lot of Gandalfs out there who've done a huge amount of prioritization research, as it's called in social science. And like, we have the world's to-do list. And you can just go start, at the very top of it and make a difference.
Is this what your curriculum looks like at the School for Moral Ambition? Do you just read Lord of the Rings?
Well, we do have a lot of, it's difficult to resist making the comparisons to all these fantasy novels. Also the Robin Hood model of talent, we're basically trying to convince people to leave the empire and join the Rebel Alliance. And anyway, there are many.
So I think that was a yes.
Yes, indeed.
Good. It sounds like fun. So one of the things I was really grappling with as I read the book, and that I've been thinking about ever since, is the line between moral responsibility and sanctimoniousness. I think there's a real risk when you tell other people to be morally ambitious of leaving them feeling judged.
Yeah.
How do you think about navigating that? Because you are about to launch a book tour where you're going to go judge a lot of people and tell them you are not doing enough with your life. I reject your choices.
Yeah.
Here are the more important things you ought to be thinking about instead.
Yeah. Cory Booker gave this incredible speech that we probably all have seen. Well, maybe not.
I haven't seen all 25 hours.
Maybe not the whole speech, but maybe this part where he said, we are living through a moral moment. And I deeply believe that as well. So you've probably have experienced that as well, sitting in class as a student or maybe in high school, learning for the first time about some of these terrible periods in history and then wondering, like, what would I have done? Well, today is the day to find out. We are living through one of those moments in history. And this is a time when characters are being tested and when you can basically show who you really are. There was this amazing interview on the Daily of the New York Times with a young corporate lawyer at one of these firms that was being bullied and threatened by the administration, and who decided, was one of the few, or I think maybe even the only one, who decided to quit his job. You know, took a real big risk to make a stand. Yeah, I think he's on the right side of history, and a lot of people currently are. There's an enormous amount of cowardice in this country right now, especially from businesses, from huge universities with incredible endowments who have all these lofty words. You know, many of these universities, you walk in there and you see words like truth and justice and freedom. And then you have these huge endowments, which I think are like meant to preserve academic freedom in tough times, but then you cave as soon as the pressure, you know, comes too intense. So this is really one of those moments. So if you're like worried of being seen as too sanctimonious or like a do-gooder, I don't know. That's like, that would be like the last worry on my mind right now. Also because honestly, I think doing good can be contagious. It's one of the simplest, but I think also one of the most important insights in the book, is that you don't do good things because you are a good person. It's the other way around. You become a good person by doing good things. And then that can be infectious as well, because people see you being bold, being brave, being courageous, and they're like, hey, maybe I can do that as well. And then it could spread like a virus.
I mean, I love that idea. I think it speaks to what Jonathan Haidt has called moral elevation.
Yeah.
And Thomas Jefferson first wrote about it centuries ago, but the basic concept of witnessing somebody else engaging in an act of moral excellence, and that lifting us up and making us more interested in doing the same.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think we need exemplars. I think we need role models to engage in that behavior and move us that way. I want to push back, though, on your claim that we're seeing a lot of cowardice right now.
Okay.
Because I'm not seeing a lot of cowards. I'm seeing a lot of people who are falling victim to what our own psychologist, Marty Seligman, called learned helplessness. So you've probably read some of the research on learned helplessness. The basic idea is that you get feedback from your environment that what you do doesn't make a difference. And you overgeneralize the conclusion that nothing I do makes a difference. And so a lot of people will say, you know, I tried calling my Congress people, I tried protesting, I tried writing letters, nothing worked, so why try? And I think that's not a crisis of cowardice. I think it's a crisis of both confidence and also of mechanisms for organizing and having collective impact. So I think it's maybe a collective action problem is underlying it. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about, like, what is the antidote to learned helplessness for people who 10 years ago might have been morally ambitious, or 5 years ago might have been morally ambitious, and now are saying, nothing worked, why try?
So I would say that this is a moment where if you have any kind of comfort still today, you know, you're like, oh, it's very bad when I switch on the news, but it's not. You know, it's not really affecting me, then you are exactly the kind of person who should do something today, right? Then you are the one who's supposed to make a difference. That for me is very much the main audience also for moral ambition. That's why I'm glad here to be here today. It's like if you have that power, if you have that, we call privilege sometimes, or you have the talent or the skill set, etc., well, use it to make a difference. And I'm not really sure whether I buy your difference between learned helplessness and cowardice. I mean, it's got to start somewhere, right? Someone has got to break through that collective action problem. I've got a whole chapter in the book about resistance heroes during the Second World War. One of those questions that I was fascinated by as a kid, like, why did some people have the courage to stand up and help persecuted Jews? And why did they risk their own lives to do that? And I always assumed that there must have been some kind of psychology of the resistance hero. And indeed, there's been quite a lot of research into this area. There was one big project a couple of decades ago by Samuel and Pearl Oliner, who wrote this big book called The Altruistic Personality Project. And it's a really interesting book, especially the last, like 50 pages or something like that, where they have all the appendixes, all the statistical evidence. And time and time
part
again,
of the book, going through the tables.
Yeah, but time and time again, you see like the letters NS, 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 so non-significant, non-significant, non-significant. They couldn't really find anything. Like the effect sizes were very small. There wasn't really anything like the altruistic personality. They still tried to salvage some of the research, so they still, wrote a book about it. Well, this is it, and it was like, no, there's really not all that much there. But then later researchers did find this one really interesting thing, is that there was this one very, predictive factor for whether people joined the resistance, yes or no. It was super simple. Like, were you asked to join the resistance? Were you asked to, frankly, risk your own life to help someone else? And then, in most cases, more than 90% of all cases, people said yes. Yes, of course, there was some selection effect going on. Like, you wouldn't ask anyone. Like, it would be risky to ask any kind of Nazi or something like that. Like, do you want to help this person? But this also explains why resistance was a very local phenomenon, right? It wasn't evenly distributed across the country, but you could really see it popping up in certain villages, for example, certain communities. And you could also see the role of certain super spreaders. And I guess, honestly, that's also how I see the spread of moral ambition. It could start on a campus like this, and maybe initially we have this collective action problem, and maybe initially some people are really skeptical, but then you have those people who are, by Cass Sunstein, this psychologist calls them the zeros, people who just don't really have a threshold for action, people who really are able to act in line with their own ideals, right? Who don't need that social support from each and everyone, from a lot of people around them. And I think that's often where it could start.
So I think we're mostly in agreement on that, but I think I have to fight you on two things here.
Okay.
First one is, I think there's an important distinction between being a coward and suffering from learned helplessness.
Okay.
I think about cowardice as basically a psychological state where people say, my fear overcomes my will to act. And I think that if I take this action, the risks are too great. I think about learned helplessness as saying, instead of being worried about the negative downside of my action, I just don't believe that there's any positive upside. And so the former is fear, the latter is futility. Like, it doesn't matter, why bother? Don't you think those are different? Empirically, they show up as different.
Yeah. And how do you overcome learned helplessness?
Well, I think ideally what you do is you show people their behavior does make a difference.
Yeah.
And I think one of the ways you do that is you actually give them the kinds of exemplars that you're describing, right? And show them, here are other people taking action. Here's a technique that works. Here's a strategy that moves the needle. I think the other approach that I think has some good data behind it is we remind people that they have been able to make a difference in the past, right? So I've shown this in some of my research where we ask people to reflect on times where they were able to help others and had an unexpectedly positive impact. And all of a sudden they say, I've done it before, maybe I can do it again.
And what if you don't know, like you really deeply don't know? Like, for example, this young corporate lawyer that I talked about, you could really feel that when he was talking to this journalist from the New York Times, like he was utterly terrified when he did it. And he thought there was a very big chance he was utterly wrecking his career. But he still did it. So is that then bravery when you just don't know?
Probably.
Yeah,
I think it is. But I think getting people to that place is a different set of interventions and conversations than helping the people who want to act but just feel like they can't. And it's just pointless.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, all right, let's try the second one then. So the Oliner research on the Holocaust rescuers.
Yeah.
One of the patterns that I thought was interesting and not only reached statistical meaningfulness in their data, but also has been replicated in future studies, is the rescuers compared to basically what bystanders who had similar upbringings.
Yeah.
One of the things that distinguished them was their parents had more discussions of the consequences of their actions.
Yeah.
So when their kid did something that they thought was hurtful or wrong, instead of just punishing them, they would explain, here is the impact that had on others, and like, how do you think they feel? And they taught, I think, a fair amount of perspective taking and compassion.
Yeah.
What did you make of that? Because you seem fairly dismissive of that program.
Yeah, so maybe I was too dismissive. So indeed, there were some things in that research that I also quite liked. Reminded me of the Dutch way of bringing up our kids.
Wait, tell us more. What does that look like?
Or maybe like the European way. There's a French book about, maybe you know that, Bringing Up Bébé, that I think the author calls it cadre in French. So the idea is that you basically give much more freedom to your children within a certain defined set of boundaries, right? And then if something goes wrong, well, you use that as a learning opportunity. And indeed also explain the reasoning why some things are immoral. So it's just not just rules, not just like because I say so. No, it's because there's a whole set of moral principles that we care about and that you should probably care about as well. So indeed, the researchers emphasized that many of the rescuers had relatively high, internal locus of control, like the feeling that they were in charge of their own life, while many of the bystanders indeed had this learned helplessness, where they were saying like, yeah, what can I do? How can I make a difference? We're much less. Someone recently said this to me, a word that I really liked, is that she was practicing on feeling more agency, right? To feel more like not just a cog in the machine, but someone who is an actor, someone who can make a difference. That you are the master of your own fate, the captain of your own ship, as one of those poems says.
Yeah, I like the point about parents teaching moral reasoning early. And I think that moral emotions are a big part of this process. And there's something I've been thinking about a lot since reading your book. I think that oftentimes what you see with parents who are really good at teaching kids to be kind, caring, responsible, upstanding, is they actually express disappointment when you don't live up to moral expectations. Yeah. And a lot of parents are like, no, I don't want to tell my kid that they're a disappointment. No. What we want to do is say that action was disappointing to me. And what that does is it highlights a standard behavior gap, and then kids are more likely to want to close the gap. And the question is why? Like, what is it about saying, like, I was disappointed in your behavior that matters? And it turns out in some of this research that what happens is when parents express the right kind of disappointment, kids start to feel guilty. Yeah. And as Irma Bombeck, I think, put it best, guilt is the gift that keeps on giving. But we actually do see that guilt is a powerful motivator of prosocial behavior. Yeah. That when you feel like your actions violated expectations or standards, or you hurt somebody else, you want to make amends and right your wrongs. Yeah. And so I was starting to think a little bit about, is one of your goals here to make people feel guiltier?
A little bit, yeah. I think that there's been a lot of dunking on shame and guilt in the pop psychology world, where sometimes, people indeed give you this expression that we need to get away from shame. But I'm like, no, I'm a pluralist. We need the whole spectrum of human emotions. And we've evolved to be able to feel shame. We are one of the very few species in the whole animal kingdom with the ability to blush. There's probably a reason for that, and that's probably also useful in some situations. I think that, I earlier mentioned this movement of the effective altruists, and I think that's very much grounded in guilt, or for quite a few of the people in that movement, who I'm very often, by the way, deeply admire. You go to one of those conferences and a lot of people will have donated one of their kidneys to a complete stranger, and I think that's, I still have both of them, sorry. But that's admirable. I don't think that you can build a big movement on just guilt alone. So for me, the right mix is probably like 80% enthusiasm and 20% guilt, but it's got to be in the mix, a little bit of it. I devoted this book to my mother, actually. So as you were explaining that research, I was thinking of my mother and of this, quite a few childhood memories where, once again, I had stolen money from her. And indeed, the look on her face, and I was like, oh, this hurts. I'm sorry.
Did you say once again? Did anyone else hear that? You had once again stolen money from her? Were you a repeat
Did I say
offender?
that once again?
You did.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. Yeah, no, I have many stories to tell about that, but I don't want to. Yeah.
Okay, I do need the record to show I'm pro guilt in healthy doses, but much more anti-shame. Because if you follow the trail of June Tangney's research, what she shows is that the two emotions tend to have opposite effects, right? So when people feel guilt, they say I did a bad thing, I got to make it right. When they feel shame, they say I'm a bad person, and then they tend to either attack whoever's making them feel ashamed, or they tend to withdraw and just become small. That is not true in all cultures. I've read at least one paper, Rick Boghossian and colleagues, showing that in the Philippines, for example, shame is actually dealt with in a much more constructive way than we do in most of the Western world. And you have to restore your honor at that point, as opposed to just kind of aggressing or retreating.
Interesting.
But I was curious to hear your Dutch take on this.
So, a couple of things. My previous book, Humankind, made an argument that we humans have evolved to work together and that we are the product of survival of the friendliest, as some evolutionary psychologists call it. And for that book, I did a lot of research into these nomadic hunter-gatherer cultures, where indeed shame also plays a really important role in stabilizing these societies, and especially controlling people who are getting a little bit too arrogant and a little bit too shameless. So how would you deal with them? Well, you use a lot of gossip, you use ridicule, and there's these fascinating anecdotes in this literature of, like, say you're like a really successful hunter, and you come back with like a huge piece of meat, and then there was this practice in one particular tribe where they would start insulting the meat, like, oh, is that it? That's really small. But that was like a cultural way of making sure that people don't turn into little Donalds. Yeah, I think that is, like, sometimes we could use a little bit of that, right? I know that I could sometimes use it. It's one of the oldest things in the book. Like, power is a dangerous thing. Like, attention is a dangerous thing. So
fascinating. It makes me think about a couple of things. One is there's a term for what you're describing in sociology. Matthew Feinberg and Rob Willer call it prosocial gossip, where one of the things you're doing is you're going around and essentially warning other people, like, do not trust this person, watch your back. And that seems to serve an important function in getting people to engage in behaviors that won't be self-destructive. I also wonder, when I think about shame, I think you're right. I think it's problematic to build a society where anyone is shameless. But I don't know that we need to get to the point of shame to get the benefit. I think what people want is anticipated shame. I want people to feel anticipatory shame about doing something wrong or harmful. And the hope is that emotion then prevents the action, and they never have to live with the shame itself. Thoughts?
So the distinction you make reminds me of someone who recently explained this distinction between anger and disgust to me in a relationship. So I sometimes experience this with my wife. Is the point this person was making is like that anger leads to connection, while disgust leads to separation. So, for example, you have a little bit of a conflict going on, or a big conflict, and then if you're angry, then you take someone seriously. You say, like, I expected better of you. Like, why did you do this? This is a betrayal of our confidence. You really recognize that person. But if it's disgust and it's, oh yeah, sure, yeah, you're right, yeah. It's that kind of, and that leads to separation, right? Which is obviously not good in a relationship. So I'm very much pro anger, which reminds me of you being pro guilt. So yeah, we're pro anger, pro guilt. What else?
I don't know if I want to come down on the pro anger side here, Rutger. I think I could get behind empathetic anger or righteous indignation, right? If you're the kinds of injustices that you've been talking about today, if that leads to a sense of moral outrage, might be useful. I think that it's much more effective, though, for propelling you into action than it is for getting you to be persuasive to others, because oftentimes when people are morally outraged, what they do is then they start to blame and shame other people, and that leads other people to then not want to rise to the occasion. So I worry a little bit about the tactics that come out of that intense emotion.
Fair enough, yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears here. So I got some feedback after our John Green event that I made one or two left turns that were too sharp.
Okay.
So get ready. This is a really sharp left turn. You did, your first book was about utopia for realists.
Yes.
And it was actually what introduced me to you originally, or how I think it's originally how we met. And you, I think, were on the very early edge of arguing for universal basic income. It's one of the first things I think about now in a world where artificial intelligence is probably not going to just displace, but altogether eliminate jobs.
Yep. Yeah.
No one seems to be talking about it. Why not? How have you updated your thinking on UBI? Like, what does the future look like from your vantage point as a historian?
Yeah, so it's more than a decade ago now that I wrote that book. And back then, basic income was this very wonky idea, pretty much forgotten. The US actually did huge basic income experiments in the 70s and the early 80s. People really thought that it was the future of welfare in this country, or that it would really totally transform the role of the state. But it didn't happen, obviously. And the reason people in the 60s and the 70s thought that basic income was the future was because back then they were also very much worried about the rise of the robots and automation. It's really interesting if you dig into this history. You can go all the way back to 1930, and the most famous, brilliant economist of the day, John Maynard Keynes, predicted that in 2030, just 5 years from now, we would have a 15-hour work week because the robots would be so good by then, and we would have made so much, economic progress that we just didn't need it anymore. That work would become this artifact, that someday our grandchildren would say, like, yeah, people used to work in the future. What is that, mommy, work? Right? Didn't really happen.
It looks like the first 95 years he was way off the mark, but we still have 5 to go.
Well, it's actually a little bit different. So for a long time, we were on track. So in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, in this country, the work week did go down, kept shrinking. But then around the 70s and the 80s, when a lot of other things started to go in the wrong direction as well, the work weeks stopped shrinking, or actually people started working more again. So I've always said that we should never underestimate capitalism's extraordinary ability to come up with new bullshit jobs. In this book, I quote some research by a bunch of economists from the Netherlands, and they use this huge data set where they that shows that around 25% of people in wealthy countries think that their own job is socially meaningless, or really doubt the value of their work. And it's not teachers or nurses or care workers. It's more people with nice diplomas and who are like, yeah, if I go on strike, does it really matter? I don't really know. So when people say like, oh, UBI is inevitable, I'm like, no, it's always going to be a political choice, right? This is a battle that needs to be fought. I think it's definitely possible. I think we could have already had a much shorter working week right now. We could have built a very different kind of economy right now. So that is something to be kept in mind. I think it's going to be more urgent, definitely, as more and more of the value is being produced by capital, basically, instead of labor. Like, in a world where the robots get better and better, it's going to be harder and harder to make your money with your own brains, especially if those brains are, like, pretty mediocre compared to the brains of some of the chatbots.
So it seems like one of the big areas of resistance to universal basic income is the premise that if you give people cash, they will get lazy and complacent. Yeah. My read of the data is that is false. We even see that like over half of lottery winners who did not like their jobs before keep doing them even after they don't have to. Yeah. And they like, if not the meaning, if they're in trivial jobs, they like the community and the structure that comes from work too. Curious to hear your reactions.
Yeah. So I'd push back a little bit, which may surprise you. Since I published Utopia for Realists, we've seen so much new evidence coming in, and especially from lower income countries and middle income countries, the evidence has been extraordinarily positive, where indeed, cash should be like our new benchmark. Whenever we want to help people, we should always ask ourselves the question, can't I just donate my own salary to this person, right? Why do I even have a job, I don't know, teaching people to milk a goat or something like that? And there are so many different interventions in the development aid world, although that's also being abolished today, sadly. But yeah, we have now a lot of new evidence about the power of cash transfers. There was this new, very powerful study, though, in the US, a very big randomized controlled trial that did show work disincentive effects. So people did work a little bit less, which I think is also sort of unsurprising and maybe also what we want, right? If we are so wealthy that we can actually afford, to give people that basic income, then why not? I mean, people work very hard in this country. In the Netherlands, where I'm from, we have the shortest working week in the world, and I can highly recommend it. I mean, work a little less. There's more in life. There's family, friends, art, music. So for me, that's actually what the future should look like. I think on average, what is it like? How many hours people work in the U.S.? I think it should go down quite a bit. I think that's what a better future should look like. But you've got to make that argument, obviously, and you got to convince people that is indeed a good future.
You moved to the U.S. recently. How many hours a week have you been working?
A lot, yeah.
How many?
Yeah. Like we work hard so that other people in the future can work less. So yeah, what is it? 70, 80? No, a lot. I've never worked as hard any time in my life. Look, I feel that really all the cliches are true about the differences between Northern Europe and the US. Like healthcare here. Damn it, what is this? It was a pretty bad experience. My wife was 7 months pregnant when we came here, and we were like, it feels like not great. Similar stories for education, where you're like, why do you even have this whole system with like the fancy universities and blah, blah, blah. Like in the Netherlands, you just go to university and no one really cares, and it's all like pretty good. I studied at Utrecht University, and then I went on an exchange program to UCLA, which is, I guess, is that a prestigious university? It's expensive at least. But the main difference that I noticed was just the quality of the chairs in the library. Like there were very fancy chairs at UCLA that I'd never seen before. But then on the other hand, what I deeply love about coming to the US is just the entrepreneurial culture. Again, the cliche is true. In the Netherlands, we have this term called hayfield culture. So as soon as you stick out your head above the hayfield, we chop it off.
Oh, that's like the Australian tall poppies.
Exactly, yeah. In Denmark, they also have a term for it. It's called Jante's Law. It's like this old story from the 19th century. Like, don't think you're better than us. Don't think you're special. Don't think you, etc. So yeah, you pay a price for being ambitious. It's more difficult. So for me, it felt quite liberating to come here. I'll tell you one short anecdote about this. I worked for a long time for this journalism platform called The Correspondent, and it was founded a decade ago. And it started with a night in Amsterdam where the co-founders invited, basically a who is who of people in media in Amsterdam, like famous journalists and entrepreneurs, etc. And they were saying, like, this is our plan. We're going to revolutionize journalism. Who thinks this is going to work? And pretty much everyone was like, no, it's not going to work. No, don't even try. Don't bother. And then I recently had a similar dinner with Amy Novogratz, one of our board members. She's here with us today. And she basically invited a who is who of awesome people in New York. And, well, guess how people responded? They were all like, yes, of course, this is going to work. You're going to conquer the world. You're going to build this huge movement of ambitious idealists. And yeah, that's sort of what you need to hear when you're starting something like that. So I really love that.
You ready for a lightning round?
Absolutely.
Okay, first question. Worst advice you hear people given when it comes to ambition?
Follow your passion. Yeah, like no one cares about your passion.
I care about your passion, just to
No. Just ask other people who've had thought long and hard about it. What needs to happen, and then become passionate about that. I've got one story in the book about an amazing entrepreneur who started this nonprofit fighting lead exposure, which is one of the biggest global health problems out there. And like no one is like, oh, my passion is lead exposure in Malawi, right? Sounds pretty wonky and far away, but like she's saving thousands of kids' lives right now. I think she's one of the most awesome people I've met in a long time.
So don't follow your passion, follow your compassion.
Yeah, and find yourself some Gandalf, right? Have that intellectual humility that probably, that's what I really like about the school that I describe in the book, the charity entrepreneurship, is that really ambitious people come there and they have their own research department who's already like, okay, we need a lead exposure NGO this year, we need insecticide-treated malaria bed nets exposure NGO this year, we need something with kangaroo care in India, okay, who's going to found that NGO, who's going to found that NGO, etc. I really like that, it's refreshing. Right? If you've probably seen this graph of the follow your passion line in Google Ngram. You know, it's like the phrase was rarely used in the 70s and the 80s, and you know, it's really gone up ever since. It's become really the cliche of career advice, and I think it can be quite liberating also for a young generation that's really struggling. Like, oh, what do I need to make of your life? Well, look, you don't have to find that out. It's almost like religion. Right? You don't have to create your own religion. You can just ask the pastor, like, what should I believe? And the person will say, well, this, and this. Like, and then you're a good person.
I don't, for the record, I don't think you should outsource your beliefs to other people, period. But
well, I mean, you got to keep thinking for yourself. But there's a lot of value in these, yeah, almost like, I mean, I'm probably giving it away right now. You know, my father is a pastor, so I am used to this idea that there is a huge amount of value in having people in the community who have thought very long and hard about what the meaning of life is, and I think that's also true for picking your cause area. There's a lot of value in listening to people who thought very long and hard about what are the biggest problems in the world, and probably the problems you've heard the most about are not the one you need to be working on because already a lot of other people are working on it. So you maximize your impact if you work on the most neglected things.
I think we utterly failed the lightning round.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I'm bad at that.
Okay, I'm gonna
keep it really short now.
A few quick fire questions. No, it was my fault because I responded. What is something you changed your mind about recently?
Yeah, so I think this is connected to the Peter Thiel book that we talked about backstage. So he wrote a book for entrepreneurs, 0 to 1, and I just love that book. I think it's an awesome book. I mean, he's a little bit of a controversial figure, maybe especially right now, but that is just an utterly brilliant book, in my view, about entrepreneurship. And I think he really opened my mind to the existence of power laws, and that they're basically everywhere, that there are these huge, steep differences in the distribution of how talented people are, also how much bigger some problems are than other problems, how much more effective some solutions are than other. So if you want to have the biggest possible impact, then actually how ambitious you are and how talented you are is less important than picking the right cause. I mean, just thinking about which problem you're going to work on, and make sure that is really, you know, somewhere here in the power law. That is like going to be the most important determinant of your impact on the world.
Progress. What is you've already given us a few hot takes tonight, but is there an unpopular opinion that you're excited to defend?
I don't believe in free will.
Oh, you're one of those?
Yeah.
But did you even choose to say that right now?
Well, it depends on what your definition of choose is. But like, unlike some of the like popular like anti-free will people, I'm really like willing to swallow the whole bitter pill, like really accept all the consequences. So you have people like, indeed, Sam Harris has made the argument, Robert Sapolsky,
yep.
But I think they're a little bit pussies. They don't really take the argument all the way. Because I think acknowledging that free will is just a totally nonsensical thing, that you can't really blame anyone. Like that punishment in terms of like, I mean, there can be instrumental reasons for putting people in prison because they're just dangerous. But there are no good ethical reasons for making people suffer or anything like that just because they've done something immoral. I'm just totally against that. I'm an utter abolitionist in that regard. And also just praising yourself, like there is no such thing as like Michael Sandel has this book written against meritocracy, and it's also one of those pussy books. It's like, come on, take the argument all the way. Like, it doesn't make sense at all. There can be pragmatic reasons for saying like we need a certain amount of inequality, but then make that argument, right, to say like everyone will be better off. But I think there are no fundamental reasons to say like, okay, you deserve a happier life, or you deserve, more comforts, etc. I just totally don't buy that.
We're going to have a whole conversation about free will later.
Okay.
And at minimum, I'm going to convince you that this is an irrelevant topic for anyone to discuss ever, that smart people have wasted many, many, many hours on.
Okay.
And at maximum, I want to convince you we do have free will. But that is another conversation. What's the question you have for me?
So I'm curious about the point around learned helplessness, and maybe also how you would advise me to help a movement that is actually helpful, help build a movement that's actually helpful for these people. Because, it's easy for me to, have some fun and, dunk on the McKinseys of this world. But people in the audience here today, it's their lives, and they got to make real choices. And you work with them a lot. So I'm very, very curious, as I embark on this adventure of trying to build a movement that convinces as many people as possible to become ambitious idealists, what should I do?
Well, I'm actually really torn on this one, because on the one hand, I loved in the book the way that you encouraged us to aim higher. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the most uplifting aspects of your philosophy is like it doesn't allow people to make excuses and just kind of focus on little things that don't really matter. At the same time, I keep thinking about this classic paper that Carl Weick wrote in the 80s on small wins and the importance of redefining the scale of social problems. Mm. And there's been a lot of research in the last few decades showing that like, one of the simplest antidotes to learn helplessness is actually just breaking what people need to do down into smaller pieces. Mm. And so what I wonder is there an opportunity with your School for Moral Ambition and with this movement that you're building to start with the high ideals and say, look, like here's the level of aspiration that we should all have. And now, like here are the first 3 actions that will move the needle that you could begin taking tomorrow.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
So what are those actions? Like for people who do want to do more, for people who are morally ambitious here, where should they begin?
Okay, I want to say 3 things. I know we're over time, sorry. One is I recently spoke to this entrepreneur who said, if you can accomplish your goals during your lifetime, then you're just not thinking big enough. So that's the part of like thinking big is important. Then you reminded me of the research about the resistance heroes, is because they didn't start by saying, yes, I'll have like a place for 5 people in the attic, right? No, it very often started with smaller acts of resistance, like you distribute an illegal newspaper, for example, or you sabotage, a car of the Nazis or something like that. And then you start becoming a different person. So maybe we got to find those kind of equivalents. I started this organization called the School for Moral Ambition, and one of the things we've developed is pretty simple. It's called a Moral Ambition Circle. So it's a group of 6 to 8 people who don't know all the answers, but who are interested in the same questions, like what are my super talents? How can I contribute? What are some of the biggest, most neglected problems in the world? How can I take the first step? How can we hold each other accountable? I was actually inspired by this movement that Sheryl Sandberg started more than a decade ago around Lean In, women breaking through the corporate glass ceiling, where she also used a book to inspire a lot of women to take a lot of small steps for a lot of big wins. So maybe that's one thing. So everyone's very much welcome to join, obviously. We're just getting started here in the US.
Would love to see some people join. I think, Rutger, you said something really profound earlier. I loved your point that it's not being a good person that leads you to do good things. It's doing good things that makes you a good person. And I think it's your best defense against virtue signaling, right? To say you actually have to go out and earn moral ambition, not just claim it. I think for me, knowing you has been a major force toward inspiring me to want to do more for other people. And I think you always challenge me to think differently. I think your book genuinely will lead people to want to become better humans, and I can't think of a better use of your 70 hours a week. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adam.